The sun hung low and cruel over the Colorado Territory, painting the land in harsh shades of gold and rust. The air was thick with dust and silence, the kind that made every sound, a hoofbeat, a door creak, carry too far. On the edge of that silence stood the small town of Cedar Ridge, a scattering of wooden buildings clinging to life against the endless wild. To most folks, Cedar Ridge was just another frontier town. But to one man, it was a cage without walls. His name was Samuel McCabe, though few remembered it. The townsfolk called him something else. The Monster. They said he'd come back from the war broken in body and soul. They said his face looked like it had been carved by fire, and that even his smile could curdle milk. They said he'd killed a man in cold blood at the Broken Wheel Saloon, and that the sheriff had quietly told him to stay away from town if he wanted to keep breathing. What they didn't say, not out loud, was that the man he killed had drawn first, that Samuel had only ever wanted to be left alone. His cabin stood 3 miles north of town, built tight against the mountain where the pines grew thick and the shadows stayed long even at noon. There he hunted, trapped, and kept to himself. Sometimes he'd come into Cedar Ridge with furs to trade, deer, elk, even bear hides, and old Murphy at the general store would weigh them without small talk. Coins slid across the counter, supplies went into a sack, and Samuel would be gone before the church bell finished its toll. Children whispered stories about him around campfires. Mothers warned their little ones, "You mind your chores, or the monster will come down from his mountain." And each year those whispers grew until they became part of the wind that blew across the town. But on one dusty October afternoon, that wind carried someone new into Cedar Ridge. Someone who would see Samuel McCabe not as a monster, but as a man. The stagecoach rolled in from Denver, wheels grinding against the rocky trail. When it stopped in front of the Cedar Ridge Hotel, a woman stepped down, holding the small hand of a boy. Her black dress was travel-stained but neat, her back straight, despite the weight of grief. Her name was Elizabeth Hartley, widowed 8 months earlier by a train accident in Kansas City. Beside her stood her 6-year-old son, Thomas, wide-eyed and clutching a small carpet bag. "Mama," he whispered, pointing at the faraway mountains. "Are those the Rockies?" Elizabeth smiled faintly, brushing the dust from his hair. "Yes, sweetheart. That's where we'll make our new start." She had come west under the Homestead Act, 160 acres of land promised to anyone brave enough to claim and work it. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had long since become her companion. When her husband died, so did the polite pity of friends. There were only debts, hungry mouths, and doors that closed too quickly. So she packed what little they owned, bought coach fare west, and prayed the frontier would hold something better than the past. A thin man with oily whiskers met her at the stage stop, introducing himself as Mr. Holloway, the local land agent. "You sure about this?" he asked, handing over a set of keys. "The Pearson place ain't much, needs work, and it's a good 2 miles from town." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "It has 4 walls and a roof. That's enough." Holloway shrugged. "Suit yourself. Wagon'll take you out there. Jensen's your driver." The wagon creaked and swayed down the rutted track as the sun began to sink behind the peaks. When at last the cabin came into view, Elizabeth felt her heart drop and then steady again. The place was worse than she'd feared. Roof sagging, door hanging crooked, fence half rotted. But the land was good. A small creek wound nearby, and the air smelled of pine and promise. Thomas squeezed her hand. "Is this our new home?" Quote. She looked at him, then at the tired little cabin that waited like a challenge. "Yes," she said softly, "this is home now." As Jensen drove away, leaving mother and son alone in the vast silence, a figure watched from the ridge above, a man on horseback, motionless as the pines. The setting sun caught the scars across his face, casting shadows where the flesh had twisted and healed badly. He watched until the woman and her boy disappeared inside the cabin. Then, without a sound, he turned his horse and rode back into the forest. That night, Elizabeth lay awake beside her sleeping son, listening to the wind sigh through the gaps in the walls. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear, brighter than she'd ever seen in Kansas City. For the first time, she realized how truly alone they were. Two souls against a world that didn't care if they survived. But she would. She had to. 3 miles north, Samuel McCabe sat by his fire, cleaning his rifle. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman he'd seen. The way she had stood straight in front of that falling-down cabin, not crying, not cursing, just looking at it like she meant to bend it to her will. He'd seen courage before, but this was different. This was quiet, stubborn, and unyielding. He told himself it was only curiosity that made him watch, that she'd be gone before the first snow, like so many dreamers before her. But as he banked his fire and stared into the embers, Samuel realized he hoped, against his better judgment, that he was wrong. The days that followed tested Elizabeth's resolve. The cabin leaked when it rained, the roof moaned under the wind, and the soil seemed more rock than dirt. Her hands blistered, then bled, as she worked from dawn till dark. When she came into town for nails and tar paper, the stares followed her. Men offered help with smiles that weren't kind. Women whispered when she turned her back. Still, she kept her chin high. "Hard work for a woman alone," said Carl Brennan, the livery owner, leaning against a post. "I manage fine," Elizabeth said. "Winter's coming fast," he warned. "Gets awful cold and lonely." She met his eyes. Loneliness is better company than the wrong man. By the time she left town, whispers had already begun to spread. And on the northern ridge, the scarred man watched her wagon rattle past, the wind tugging at her black veil. He didn't know it yet, but their lives had already crossed paths. Soon the town that called him a monster would learn the truth about the man behind the scars, and the widow who wasn't afraid to see him. The first month tested Elizabeth in every way a person could be tested. The mornings were cold enough to bite through her thin gloves, and the nights were lonelier than she had imagined. The roof leaked when it rained. The wind howled through the gaps in the logs, and her hands grew raw from fixing fences and hauling water. But she refused to give up. Every nail she drove and every board she mended was another promise that she and Thomas would survive. Thomas tried to help, his small hands carrying wood, feeding the few chickens they'd bought, and fetching water from the creek. At night, he would curl beside her on the floor, whispering questions about the stars, about the wolves they sometimes heard howling in the hills. She'd hold him close and tell him the same thing every night. "We're safe, sweetheart, we're going to make it." But safety in Cedar Ridge was a fragile thing. One gray afternoon, while fixing a broken fence, Elizabeth heard a horse approaching. A man dismounted near the gate, tall, sharp-featured, with slicked-back hair and eyes too pale to be kind. "Mrs. Morrison," he said smoothly, using the false name she had given when she arrived. "Jacob Mueller, ma'am. I run the bank in town." Elizabeth straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Mr. Mueller, what can I do for you?" "Just checking on our newest resident. Folks say you're working the old Pearson place. Hard land for a woman alone. Dangerous, too." "I manage," she said evenly. "I don't doubt it. But you might find life easier with help." His gaze lingered where it shouldn't. A partnership, perhaps. Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten. "Thank you, but I'm not looking for a partner." Mueller's smile thinned. "You might change your mind when the snow comes. Out here, survival often depends on making the right friends." "I have all the friends I need." "Do you?" His tone was oily now, mocking. "Folks talk, Mrs. Morrison. They'll talk more if you keep turning away kindness." Elizabeth met his eyes. "Then let them talk." He hesitated, clearly not used to being dismissed. "Suit yourself," he said finally, mounting his horse. "Winter's long in these parts, lonelier still." As his horse disappeared down the trail, Elizabeth stood trembling, not from fear but from anger. She knew men like him, men who thought power made them untouchable. She had seen enough of them back east to recognize the danger they carried in polite words. That night, as the rain began to fall, she woke to the sound of water dripping through the roof and something worse, the rush of the creek outside, louder than before. She stepped out into the storm and froze. The water had risen fast, turning brown with mud and debris, surging straight toward the cabin. "Thomas!" she cried, pulling him from bed. "Get your boots!" But before they could move, a voice shouted through the storm. "Get to higher ground!" Elizabeth spun, and through the sheets of rain she saw him, the man from the ridge. He was on horseback, soaked to the bone, his scarred face lit by lightning. "The dam upstream's breaking," he shouted. "You'll lose the cabin if you stay." Quote, "I can't leave," she yelled back. "Everything we own is here." He dismounted and strode toward her, the storm whipping around them. "Then help me divert it. You got tools?" "Shovels in the barn." "Get 'em!" For the next 2 hours they fought the raging water together. The man moved with a quiet, fierce strength, his hands sure and fast, even as the mud pulled at their boots. He showed her where to dig, where to pile stones to turn the current. Thomas worked beside them, wide-eyed but determined, passing smaller rocks with his small hands. When the dam finally broke, sending the flood roaring harmlessly down the valley, they stood, soaked and trembling in the mud. The creek was back in its channel. The cabin still stood. Elizabeth turned to him, breathing hard. "You saved our home." He shrugged, wiping rain from his scarred cheek. "Didn't do it for thanks." "Then at least let me offer coffee. You must be freezing." Quote, his gray eyes flicked to hers, then away. "People won't take kindly to you knowing me, Mrs. Morrison." "I'll decide who I know, mister." He hesitated. "McCabe, Samuel McCabe." "Then thank you, Mr. McCabe." He gave a small nod, almost a bow, then turned toward his horse. Thomas tugged at Elizabeth's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered loudly, "is that the monster?" Elizabeth's heart stopped. "Thomas!" she hissed. "Apologize right now." But Samuel only looked at the boy, and something softened in his ruined face. "That's what they call me, son." "You scared?" Thomas studied him a moment, then shook his head. "No, sir. Mama says monsters aren't real, just people who do bad things." For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. Then, quietly, he replied, "Your mama's a wise woman." He mounted his horse. "Check your roof," he said, voice rough but calm. "Those leaks will get worse." Elizabeth watched him ride off into the storm, his figure swallowed by the dark trees. Her hands shook as she gathered Thomas close. "Is he really a monster, Mama?" the boy asked softly. She looked at the place where he had vanished. "No, Thomas," she whispered, "I don't think he is." By morning, the story had already spread through Cedar Ridge. People said the monster had been seen near the widow's cabin. They said he'd been inside, that he'd stayed the night. When Elizabeth went to town for supplies, conversation stopped the moment she stepped through the door. Mrs. Garrett, the boarding house owner, gave a tight smile. "Heard McCabe was out at your place, Mrs. Morrison." "He helped divert floodwater that would have destroyed my home," Elizabeth said evenly. "Still," Mrs. Garrett sniffed, "not proper, a woman alone entertaining such a man." "I didn't entertain anyone," Elizabeth replied. "He saw people in need and helped. I suppose that's more Christian than gossip." Gasps rippled through the store. Even old Murphy looked away. Elizabeth paid for her flour and nails in silence and left with her head high, but her heart heavy. That night, she found a deer carcass hanging neatly from her porch rail, fresh and dressed for cooking. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but she knew. She said nothing to Thomas, only baked bread the next morning and left a loaf on the stump at the edge of her property. It was gone by dawn. Days passed like that, silent exchanges between mountain and homestead. A sack of flour appeared on her porch. She mended a torn shirt she found by her fence. She began to look for his shadow on the ridge, without admitting to herself why. Then, one evening, as snow began to fall, she heard Thomas's voice outside. "Mr. McCabe, look what I drew!" Elizabeth rushed out, heart pounding. Her son stood chatting happily with the scarred man who lingered at the edge of the trees. "Thomas, inside," she called. "It's all right," Samuel said quietly. "He's a good boy." "You shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He lifted a small bundle. "Brought you this. Rabbit stew meat." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her boots crunching on the snow. "Then come in, at least for coffee. It's cold out." He looked torn, every muscle tense. "People talk," he murmured. "Let them." Quote. For the first time in years, Samuel McCabe stepped across another person's threshold. Inside, the warmth and lamplight seemed to take him by surprise. He sat stiffly, as though unsure what to do with his hands. Thomas peppered him with questions about hunting in the mountains, and Samuel answered each one with quiet patience. He even smiled once, a crooked, painful smile that changed his whole face. When he finally rose to leave, Thomas was asleep by the fire. Samuel looked down at the boy, his voice low. "He's not afraid." "Children see what's real," Elizabeth said softly, "not what they're told to fear." Samuel's gray eyes met hers. "That's dangerous in a place like this." "Maybe," she said, her heart steady. "But living in fear is worse." He left into the falling snow, and Elizabeth watched him disappear into the night. Something had shifted. Something she couldn't name yet, but she felt it in the quiet beating of her heart. The next morning, Cedar Ridge woke with a new rumor, and Elizabeth Hartley's life would never be the same. By the next week, everyone in Cedar Ridge was talking. The whispers had turned to open judgment. The widow had entertained the monster, they said. She'd let him into her home, let him sit at her table. Some claimed he'd stayed the night, others that he'd bewitched her with war magic. The truth didn't matter, only the telling. When Elizabeth walked into Murphy's store, the chatter stopped dead. Women turned their backs. Men watched with smirks that made her skin crawl. "Shameful," Mrs. Garrett muttered loudly, loud enough for all to hear. Elizabeth placed her list on the counter with steady hands. "What's shameful," she said evenly, "is how this town treats kindness as a sin." Her voice didn't tremble, but her heart did. From that day, her credit was cut off. Prices doubled. Children whispered cruel things to Thomas at the well. Still, she held her ground. She had faced worse storms than gossip. But trouble was coming. Not in whispers this time. 2 days later, she saw dust rising on the road. 3 men rode toward her cabin. Jacob Mueller led them, his pale eyes cold. Behind him came Frank Garrett and a burly ranch hand she didn't know. Elizabeth set down her axe and waited, her pulse steady but hard. "Mrs. Hartley," Mueller said, dismounting. "I was told you were warned," he continued, his tone oily. "But it seems you need reminding. This friendship you've struck with McCabe is dangerous, for you. For your boy." "My friendship is my own affair," she replied. "Is it?" He smiled thinly. "You've brought shame to this community. A woman alone, keeping company with a murderer. People are concerned about your fitness as a mother." Her voice went cold. "You will leave my property now." "Careful," Garrett sneered. "You talk mighty big for a woman with no one to back her." Elizabeth's grip tightened on the axe handle. "I said leave." Mueller's mask of politeness cracked. "You think that scarred freak will protect you? He couldn't even protect himself. This land will be mine before spring. You'll come crawling to me then." She took one step forward. "I'd rather starve than crawl to you." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Mueller jerked his reins and turned his horse. "Have it your way," he said. "But remember, accidents happen out here." When they rode off, Elizabeth's legs nearly gave out. She knew what he meant. The threats wouldn't stay words for long. That night, she barred the door and kept the shotgun close. Thomas, sensing her fear, stayed quiet. The next morning, she found the chicken coop smashed, her hens dead and scattered. The fence was torn down. Broken glass glittered near the well. She didn't cry. She just cleaned it up and started again. But Samuel noticed. That evening, as the sky turned purple, he appeared at her door. "You've been targeted?" he said simply. "I can handle myself." "You shouldn't have to." His gray eyes softened. "This is my fault. I brought this on you." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You brought us safety when we were drowning. You brought food when we had none. This," she gestured toward the damage, "isn't your fault. It's the fault of cowards." He didn't argue, just nodded once. Then let me stand with you. Quote, from that night on, Samuel stayed near, not in her cabin, but close enough that she could see smoke from his fire on the ridge. Every morning her woodpile was higher. Every evening her traps were checked, her fences mended. It was protection without words, and somehow it was more comforting than any promise could have been. One night, as snow began to fall, Elizabeth found him outside splitting wood. "You'll freeze," she said, holding out a lantern. He looked up, his face half in shadow. "Used to worse." "Come inside," she said quietly. "There's stew." For a moment, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he followed her in. Thomas grinned from the hearth. "Mr. McCabe." Samuel nodded, setting his coat aside. He ate quietly, his rough hands clumsy on the spoon. When he was done, Elizabeth poured him coffee. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Samuel spoke. "I shouldn't be here. Folks already hate you for knowing me." "Then let them," she said softly. "I've lived through gossip, hunger, and fear. I'm done hiding from what I want." Quote, "What is it you want, Elizabeth?" Her voice was steady. "To live without fear, to see people as they are, not as others say they are, and to share my table with a man who's earned my respect." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face broke. "You don't know what it's like," he said quietly, "to have folks look at you and see a monster, to forget what it feels like to be touched without pity." Elizabeth reached across the table and took his hand. His breath caught. He flinched, as though her touch burned. But he didn't pull away. "They call you a monster," she said softly, "but I'm not afraid." He stared at her, his scarred face unreadable. Then, slowly, his fingers closed around hers, rough, strong, human. "Elizabeth," he said, her name barely a whisper. Thomas stirred in his sleep, and she pulled her hand back gently. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's work will be heavy." But Samuel didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. At dawn, the sound of hooves shattered the silence. Muller had returned, this time with hired guns, 7 men, rifles ready. Their leader was a stranger with cold, pale eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "McCabe," he shouted from the yard, "you've been warned." Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. Elizabeth stood beside him, the shotgun steady in her grip. "You've got one chance to ride out," Samuel said calmly. The stranger laughed. "And miss all the fun?" The first shot cracked like thunder. Splinters flew from the porch post. Thomas screamed inside. Samuel fired back, dropping one of the riders. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, smoke, shouting. The attackers circled, firing wildly. Samuel fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. Elizabeth fired twice, reloading with shaking hands. When the smoke cleared, the attackers were gone. 2 bodies lay in the snow. Mueller was among the wounded, clutching his arm and cursing. Samuel limped toward him, rifle steady. "You come again," he said, "and I'll finish it." The sheriff arrived hours later, followed by a federal marshal. They took one look at the scene and knew the truth. Self-defense, clear as day. Mueller was finished. His power in Cedar Ridge crumbled with his pride. In the months that followed, the town began to change. The whispers grew quieter. Folks who'd once crossed the street now nodded when Samuel passed. Elizabeth reopened her garden, her laughter returning with the spring. One morning, as the thaw began, Samuel stood beside her by the creek, the same creek that had almost taken everything from them. He took her hand, rough and scarred in his own. "You changed this place," he said. She smiled. "No, Samuel, we did." From the ridge, the first wildflowers bloomed where snow had been. The people of Cedar Ridge no longer called him a monster. They called him a husband, a father, a good man. And the woman who had once arrived with nothing but hope had built a life, a family, and a legacy that whispered through the valley for years to come. All because one day, when everyone else turned away, she had taken a broken man's hand and said, "I'm not afraid."